Good morning. It's Wednesday, February 12th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 495 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is Professor Ed Husain from Georgetown University, who also serves as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He recently wrote an insightful piece in Politico offering key recommendations to ensure U.S. success in the Middle East ahead of Secretary of State Marco Rubio's visit to the region. I caught up with Professor Husain yesterday for a pre-recorded interview, which we'll play for you momentarily. The winds of war are blowing again in the Middle East. Donald Trump has warned Hamas to hand over the rest of Israeli hostages by Saturday, or all bets are off. His words, not mine. Hamas fired back, saying it will not be threatened. The group has reportedly stopped using cell phones for fear of being tracked by Israeli intelligence. At the same time, the group seems to be enjoying all the uproar in the Arab world created by Donald Trump's call for the evacuation of Palestinians from the war zone that Hamas itself created. The Houthis, meanwhile, say they will return to war if the ceasefire collapses in Gaza. That will mean more ballistic missiles fired at Israel and more vessels harassed on the Red Sea. Hezbollah, too, will likely get back into the action if the fighting resumes. The group lost 2/3 of its arsenal to Israeli airstrikes, but it still has 1/3, and we're talking about 50,000 projectiles or more. Nobody knows what the new Syria will do if war returns. This regime is essentially as old as the ceasefire itself. It all boils down to Benjamin Netanyahu now. The Israeli prime minister has a green light from Donald Trump to go back into Gaza. The question is whether this is in Israel's interest. This is a real debate right now in that country. I don't know what move is the right one, but I do know this. The future of the Middle East hangs in the balance, and wars only produce one thing consistently, and that's unintended consequences. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the UN suspended all humanitarian work in Yemen's Sada province. Sada is in northern Yemen. It's controlled by the Houthis. A spokesman for the UN said that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres decided to temporarily halt operations in the area after Houthis arrested 7 UN staffers last month. But it's all a bit odd because the Houthis have rounded up no less than 24 UN employees since 2021. The temporary suspension is intended to facilitate the release of staffers in Houthi custody. The affected province is home to approximately 1 million people. 7 UN agencies had been operating in the area, including the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the World Food Program. Yesterday, the UN announced that a World Food Program worker died in a Yemeni prison. The cause of death is unclear. We're going to continue to watch that space. Headline 2. The Palestinian Authority is reportedly canceling its notorious pay-for-slay program. Pay-for-slay is Social Security for Let me try that again. Pay-for-slay is Social Security for sociopaths. The PA rewards terrorists and their families with monthly stipends. This has been going on for years, and it has been a source of serious tension between the Palestinian Authority and the U.S. Congress. But on Monday, PA President Mahmoud Abbas reportedly signed a decree revoking the legislation that enables the payment program. In exchange, Ramallah wants Washington to repeal the Taylor Force Act, which froze direct U.S. financial assistance to the PA so long as pay-for-slay continues. The act is named for U.S. Army veteran Taylor Force, who was stabbed to death by a Palestinian terrorist in Yaffo in 2016. The PA is jockeying for a role in Gaza. Let's be clear about this. Abbas thinks that ending this program will make his government halal again here in the United States, but it's still haram in my book. Ramallah is simply readjusting its payment program. Instead of allocating funds according to the length of a terrorist prison sentence, the PA will allocate funds according to financial need. And instead of issuing stipends through the Ministry of Social Development, the money will be paid through the Palestinian National Economic Empowerment Foundation. Who chairs the foundation? The Palestinian Minister of Social Development. Get that? So if you're not disgusted, you're not paying attention. Let's not repeal the Taylor Force Act. Headline 3, Jordan's King Abdullah visited the White House yesterday. The million-dollar question, how would the monarch respond to President Trump's push to relocate Palestinians from Gaza to Jordan and Egypt? Abdullah played coy. He told reporters that he has to keep his country's best interests in mind, which is, of course, what every leader of any country would say. And he also said that Egypt is working on a plan for Gaza on behalf of Arab countries, and that we should hang tight until Cairo presents its ideas. Any day now, I'm guessing. But in the meantime, President Sisi today is saying that he will not visit the White House so long as this is the topic of discussion. Meantime, the king did say his country is willing to accept 2,000 sick Palestinian children from Gaza. Abdullah noted that other countries might also be interested in taking sick children for treatment. While a couple thousand kids are a far cry from the millions of people that Trump wants the Hashemite kingdom to accept, Trump welcomed Abdullah's offer as a beautiful gesture. And bonus headline 4, Israel reportedly asked the Trump administration to push back the deadline for the IDF's withdrawal from southern Lebanon. The administration said no. Accordingly, the IDF was supposed to withdraw completely from South Lebanon by January 27th. However, the Israelis asked for an extension because the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, failed to sufficiently deploy throughout the area. Washington granted that extension on January 26th, and then Israel requested another extension because Lebanese troops still haven't gained control of southern Lebanon. We all knew that was going to happen. The LAF has failed to act against Hezbollah and secure South Lebanon for decades, despite UN Resolution 1701 calling for exactly that. Israel wants to maintain a presence at key sites to secure the border, but Washington wants the IDF out of Lebanon by February 18th. That's next week, and it's a recipe for disaster. Trump's deputy Middle East envoy, Morgan Ortagus, told reporters that the 18th is a firm date. Right, just in time for the Gaza ceasefire to collapse. And here I was hoping for extended calm in the Middle East. And now it's time for my interview with Professor Ed Husain from Georgetown University and the Council on Foreign Relations. If you haven't read his recent Politico piece on how the U.S. can enhance its success and efficacy in the Middle East foreign policy space, I highly recommend it. We caught up yesterday for this pre-recorded conversation, which we'll play for you right now on the program. Welcome to the program, Professor Ed Husain.
Great to be with you, Jonathan Schanzer.
All right. Well, you've just written a provocative article, one that was directed at Marco Rubio. I read it, found it fascinating, and I saw that you essentially highlighted 5 or 6 areas that our foreign policy should focus or not focus. And I thought maybe it'd be a good idea for us to walk through them. So let's go in no particular order. I think the first was no democracy. Don't go around trying to promote democracy around the world. Explain.
Well, I've been fascinated by this obsession in the US government, plural, since the Arab Spring, that whenever there's a revolution, the people that got rid of King George III here, their descendants think every revolution must be a good thing and we must go out and support wherever there are revolutionary attempts. And I draw upon the great English-Irish philosopher Edmund Burke, who supported the American uprising, but not the French uprising. So I think in that spirit, we should be very careful going around promoting democracy in a part of the world where there is not a strong enough culture of the rule of law or individual liberty. And in the absence of those two things, democracy do not work, as per Gaza, Iran, and a whole range of other countries. So that's why I think the US focus ought to be on the rule of law and individual liberties rather than going around trying to create mini Americas.
Yeah, I think, by the way, mini Americas sound a bit dizzying right now, given the state of our own politics. So I don't know if we need to replicate that right now. Okay, the second one was about using the laws of physics.
Yeah, under the Obama years, it was really strange watching attempts by the White House to side broadly with the Iranians in order to undermine the Arabs, because the Arabs were seen as this very difficult constituency to manage. And I just think that's wrong. And one of the founding fathers of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, famously tried to pursue a strategy of minorities, the Kurds, the Turks, the Iranians, against the Sunni majority. I think after what Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat did in Egypt, as well as the Abraham Accords, the vast majority of Sunni Arab Muslims, we're talking 500 million people in and around the Middle East, those are our natural allies for the West for a whole range of reasons. So work with the majority rather than try to create a new majority of minorities, which I think is a disaster on so many levels.
Yeah, there are those who suggest that we can work with all the different minorities in Iran to help cobble them together to help bring down the regime. That is largely rejected by royalists and sort of traditional Persian nationalists. I do wonder whether there's something there, but I take your point. The third area that you mentioned was the Abraham Accords, that we need to continue to pursue them. I assume you mean primarily Saudi Arabia, but are we limiting ourselves to Saudi, or does it go beyond that?
I think part of the challenge is that here in Washington, D.C., there's an attempt to try to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords. I think that framing is flawed. Saudi Arabia does not wish to be part of the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia wishes to see the Abraham Accords as a precedent for normalizing with Israel in exchange for security guarantees from America and an assumed Palestinian state and so on. So they've got their own criteria, as you and your listeners know only too well, Jonathan. But all I'd say is that the Abraham Accords have succeeded against Iranian and other attempts to undermine them. So what ought to happen is to bring other nations either into the Abraham Accords, or call them the Isaac Accords or the Ishmael Accords or the Moses Accords, whatever it is. Bring in other nations into the circle of peace with Israel and its Arab allies, i.e. Morocco, Bahrain, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, and so on. So expand the normalization process, but do not be fixated only with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia will come in its own time and way.
I think that's probably true. I was talking to a colleague some time ago about what we call Saudi watching. Everybody sort of trying to predict what the kingdom is going to do or what it meant when it said X or Y. But I do think that, the Saudi component of all of this, whether we call it the Abraham Accords, whether we call it the Isaac and Ishmael Accords, I don't really care. But I do think that it probably sets off a chain of events, a domino effect, if you will, of other countries that are going to look to normalize. And that's why I think it's so crucial here. But I do take your point that we need to let Saudi go. This process is going to have to unfold in a way that feels uniquely Saudi, which could, by the way, be glacially slow, and that we need to be patient here in that respect. The next thing that you had on your list was Syria. I have to say, I've been very alarmed at the trajectory of the new regime in Syria. Not that I wasn't alarmed about the trajectory of the previous regime in Syria, but this looks like a sanjak of Turkey at this point. As I understand it, the lira is being traded there. Turkish personnel are crawling all over the country. And this is basically an al-Qaeda regime that is now completely beholden to a wayward NATO ally that is a supporter of terrorism at the end of the day. What's your recommendation for how we handle such a messy business in Syria?
I think that the current government in Syria owes the world an explanation as to what Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and its leader, he used to go by the name Al-Jolani, was the Golan Heights. I mean, he wasn't born in the Golan Heights. Why take on that name? Why abandon that name? Which leads to a whole range of other questions which are much more fundamental. He was involved in Iraq fighting against America. How many Americans did he kill? What remorse is there on his part for support for Osama bin Laden and support for the 9/11 terrorist attack? What does he have to say about his Jewish neighbor, Israel? He gives up the Golan Heights in his name, but does he retain claim to it? If so, what does that mean for Israel's security? And I think those are the difficult questions, which I'm sorry to say, those people have been busy trying to whitewash the Damascus regime and an appeal to lift sanctions in America haven't paid attention to, and I think it's fundamentally important that we do so.
I fully agree. You mentioned the Kurds too. The Kurds are, of course, going to be a key component of whatever Syria policy begins to take shape. What's the recommendation there, other than, I'm assuming, protect them?
Yes, but I think my wider concern, Jonathan, is that here in Washington, we don't talk about the Kurds. We don't understand the Kurds. It's just one big monotonous block for so many people in and around government. And I just think it's important to realize that there are Kurds who are our friends and allies, and there are some Kurds who are anti-West. And I think a greater degree of studying and understanding is required of the Kurdish issue. But ultimately, America should not be taking sides on this, rather to be using this issue to bring greater American diplomacy, force, and power into the region.
Yeah, I do tend to agree. I do think that when we talk about the PKK and the YPG and some of these other actors, they're not friends, but or maybe they have been friends, but we need to be very careful about how we shape their future right now. It is a delicate issue, to put it mildly. Last question before I let you go. And this is, of course, a big one that is near and dear to the hearts of all of us here at FDD. You talk about Iran. It is a huge threat. It is potentially a huge opportunity given the weakness that we see. How do you counsel Secretary of State Marco Rubio moving forward in your memo?
The first thing is to realize that most recent tactical victory against Iran, thanks to the actions of Israel in containing Iran's main proxies, does not mean that the head of the octopus has been removed. Some of the tentacles may have been removed, but knowing Iran and its history of having fought the longest war in history, 700 years against the Romans, they take a long view. And my fear is that the secretary and his team will more or less be sitting on their laurels and thinking our ally Israel has done such a fantastic job, and almost look to other issues in the region. My concern is that we should not. My concern is that we should fear that Iran will reassert itself in the coming months. My most important point is, I think whenever we see the Iranian attempt to hit back at the West, recently, as Khamenei saying yesterday he will attack, that we should hit them hard, hit them preemptorily, and make sure that our allies, both Arab allies and Israeli allies, never again feel that the Houthis or Hezbollah or Hamas or a whole range of others can hold them hostage in the way that they did over the last 10 years or so. So weaken Iran's external presence everywhere, all the time, without any reservations. But ultimately, regime change is up to the Iranians, and if it comes, we should support it, as Edmund Burke did in relation to America, knowing that what will come will be better than what's there now.
Yeah, and by the way, I tend to think that you do that, and you begin to sort out perhaps some of the road ahead as it relates to the Abraham Accords. I think you do that. You gain the confidence of the Saudis. You begin to start to shape other elements of the Middle East, as we've discussed here today. I want to thank you for the thoughtful piece that you penned, and I want to thank you, Ed Husain, for joining us this morning on the
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. Apologies for some of those echoes there. We were experiencing some audio challenges yesterday, but I think you probably all got the gist. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Elaine Dzansky from our Center on Economic and Financial Power has a piece in the New York Post on Trump's groundbreaking executive order designating international cartels as terrorist organizations, in part due to their role in trafficking the drug fentanyl across our borders. Elaine emphasizes that while this is a crucial first step, it's just the beginning. The U.S. administration must step up the pressure and treat the opioid crisis for what it truly is, which is a national security threat. Check out the inaugural edition of FDD's Trump administration foreign policy tracker. We had been doing a Biden foreign policy tracker. Our experts and scholars assess the administration's foreign policy across the board. Our scholars call balls and strikes. As always, the tracker provides trend lines ranging from very positive to very negative, with neutral in the middle, for each area that they monitor. For example, they found that the U.S. policy on Israel and the Gulf are trending very positively, while policy on China and Turkey are trending neutral, and Korea is trending negative. Check it out on our website and keep coming back for our nonpartisan analysis each and every month. Finally, FDD research analyst Ahmed Sharawi has a new piece for the Atlantic Council on Jordanian King Abdullah's visit to Washington, marking the first official trip by an Arab leader to the U.S. during President Trump's second term. Ahmed outlines key agenda items, including the president's unconventional plan for Gaza, otherwise known as Gaza-Lago, and he examines how Amman's strong ties with Washington might end up influencing its position on Gaza, particularly Trump's proposal to relocate a significant portion of Gaza's civilians to the Hashemite kingdom, Egypt, and beyond. That's it for this Wednesday edition of the program. I once again encourage you to check out the expert analysis of our shop on our website, FDD.org. Please do read our quick takes on X at FDD or watch the videos we post on Instagram and YouTube. And as ever, you can make that tax-deductible donation at FDD.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief, this time with Israeli Air Force Major General in Reserves, Tal Kelman, who was formerly the Senior IDF Planning and Cooperation Officer. Should be a good one. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, somewhat sick, signing off for FDD.